purpose of this video is to illustrate the exact procedures that are required to tighten a tent properly so that your tent corners do not sag and collect water when you have heavy rains, and so that your tent looks nice and tight and it will withstand the wind like it should. You can get your corners tight. It requires some extra effort, and there are certain procedures that must be followed in order to do so. We will attempt to address all of these procedures one by one in this video. Let's start out by looking at a couple of still photographs. This tent that you see here is a 30 by 30 tent, and notice how that from the corner to the center of the tent there is a completely straight line. There's no dip whatsoever on the corner, and also the perimeter from corner to corner is nice and tight. There are no dips or wrinkles. This is a result of tightening a tent properly. This is a picture of a 30 by 50 tent. We're looking at it from the 30-foot end. This tent has all sorts of problems. It's tight, but it has been tightened improperly. We will discuss each problem that the tent has in its turn. First of all, let's look at the corner on the left-hand side. You'll notice that from the corner of the tent up towards the center pole, the top of the center pole, there's a huge dip in the tent. This is caused potentially by several things. It could be because the stakes are too close to the tent, or more than likely it's because the corners were tightened snugly to begin with, but they were not tightened enough, and then the edges of the tent were tightened really tight, and that caused the space between the corner and the top of the center pole to bag downward to create a bow. It's very, very important that the corners are tightened extremely tight in the proper sequence prior to tightening the sides of the tent. All this will be discussed in greater detail in this video. The next problem that this tent has that we need to discuss are the two areas of wrinkles that you see on the left and the right hand side of the side pole that is in the middle of the side of the tent, directly below the center pole. These wrinkles are caused because the side pole and the rope that are in the center of the 30-foot side on this tent on opposite ends were not tightened enough before the two side poles and the two ropes on the left and the right hand side of that center side pole rope were tightened. This is what happens when ropes are tightened out of sequence or over tightened in relation to the ropes around them. The main purpose of this video is to first of all show you that you can get your tent tightened properly, and also show you exactly how to do that. Later on we'll discuss the steps more specifically, but first of all we'd like to go ahead and look at some pictures of tents that have been tightened properly, just to illustrate how nice your tent can look when you learn how to tighten it properly. first critical part of getting your tent tight is how well you square up your tent before you ever drive your first stake. The tent should be laid out and then stretched into a nice tight square prior to measuring for the stakes. The 2 stakes at each corner will go between 5 and 6 feet from the corner, 90 degrees parallel to the corner. This is critical because if your stakes are too close to the tent, then the angle of the pull on the rope will be incorrect and you will never be able to get your tent tightened properly. What will happen if your stakes are too close to the tent is that when you push the poles up to tighten the rope will seem tight, but the rope really will not be pulling the tent outward in order to stretch the tent. The rope will be pulling more upward on the stake. The problem with this is that your tent doesn't stretch out properly, and it also puts more stress on the stake than it should have. It tends to pull the stake upward out of the hole rather than against the stake, where the stake can remain stationary and the tension can be applied to the tent in order to stretch your tent. Now the opposite is if your stakes are too far out, then when you get your ropes tight, first of all, it'll be very hard to get the ropes tight, and there will not be enough downward pressure on your side poles, so your side poles, instead of being stationary and hard to move, will tend to be loose on the ground, and they will feel like they're insecure. The distance that the stake goes into the ground from the tent is critical. It needs to be between 5 and 6 feet, 5 feet on the smaller tents, 6 feet on like your 60 by 300s or 60 by 120s, 5 feet from the corner, 90 degrees like you see in the picture. Off of each corner you put 2 stakes, 5 feet on the smaller tents, 6 feet if you have like a 40-foot or a 60-foot wide tent. This is the most important thing before you ever start driving your stakes, is the stake placement. Everything else will not work unless this distance is correct. When all the stakes are correctly positioned, then it will be time to begin to drive the stakes into the ground. When all the stakes are driven, then the next step will be to attach the guy ropes to all the stakes. Remember to leave some slack in the rope so that you'll be able to push the side poles up when you're ready to raise the perimeter. After that, then you will raise the perimeter of the tent. Next, you need to tie all of the jump ropes. Then you will raise the center poles. Now that the center poles are up and vertical and the ropes are tied, we can start to tighten the tent. The way you normally tighten a tent is you go to one of the corners of the tent and you will want to tighten that corner, but not extremely tight, just snug, because you don't want to pull the tent out of square. One person tilts the pole inward towards the center of the tent, the other person can take the slack out of the rope, and then you help each other push the tent pole up until it's nearly vertical. After you get the first corner tight, then you walk to the opposite corner, and you'll get that corner as tight as you can on the rope that is pulling against the corner that you just tightened. But the corner rope that is pulling against the opposite end of the tent that you haven't tightened yet, you just want to get it snug, because if you get it too tight, you'll pull your tent out of square. After you get the ropes adjusted, push the pole vertical, and then you walk to the opposite end of the tent. Once you get to the opposite end of the tent, the first corner there, you want to go ahead and tighten the rope that is pulling against the end of the tent where you just were as tight as you can, but the rope that's pulling against the corner where you have not tightened yet, you just want it snug so you don't pull your tent out of square. After you get your ropes adjusted, go ahead and push the tent pole up until it's nearly vertical. And at that point, you will walk over to the fourth corner of the tent. And on this corner, you will attempt to tighten both of the ropes as tight as you can get them. After you get the four corners tight, you want to go back and look at the corners of the tent and make sure that you have not pulled anything out of square. If you've pulled a corner out of square, you may need to loosen a rope on one side of the tent and tighten it on the opposite side to pull the tent back in square. After all the four corners are adjusted properly, then you tighten the pole that is in the center of the 20-foot side of the tent, and then you walk to the opposite end of the tent and you tighten the side pole that is in the center of that end. After you have all four corners tight and the poles in the short sides of the tent tight, then you'll walk over to one of the long sides of the tent and you will tighten those poles and those ropes. But there again, you want to leave them fairly snug so that you don't pull your tent out of square. If you tighten the first side too tight, then it'll bow the tent out on that side. After you get those two poles and those ropes tight, then you walk to the opposite side of the tent and you will tighten now these ropes as tight as you can get them, because the other side of the tent has been secured, so now you can tighten the tent really tight. You may have to check all the ropes 2 or 3 times to make sure that every rope is completely tight and does not have any slack at all whatsoever in it. It takes a little extra time to do this double checking, but it's well worth it. Just go up to each pole, check your rope, and if it seems loose, then knock your pole back inside, retighten the rope, and push the side pole up again. Every rope should be extremely tight. When all the ropes are good and tight, then you will want to tie off the ends of the guy ropes. You can see the guys doing that in this shot. You basically take the end of the guy rope, make a loop, or a half hitch if you will, and pull it up onto the tight part of the rope so that the loose end of the guy rope is not just dangling on the ground. Available as an option are what we call ratchet straps. If you're struggling getting your corners tight, you may want to invest in the ratchet strap. It's a ratcheting strap that has a 12,000 pound test. What you do is you insert the hooks into the ring at the corner of the tent, and then you will actually tilt the corner pole back in towards the center of the tent to relieve the tension that was on the ropes, and it'll probably be at about a 30 to a 45 degree angle. The corner pole will be. Then you take the end of the ratchet that has the ratchet on it, and there's a large loop in the webbing. You simply slip the webbing loop over the stake on both of the stakes, and when you have both of the ratchet straps looped over the stake, then you take the ratchet handle and you insert the piece of webbing that had the hook on it into the ratcheting part of the ratchet. After you insert the webbing into the slot in the center of the ratchet, then you will pull the excess webbing back up through the ratchet to remove some of the slack. When the webbing is snug, then you go ahead and you ratchet the ratchet up 2 or 3 times until it's just barely snug, and then you will repeat it on the other side. You take the webbing, you insert it into the slot, into the center of the ratchet, pull the slack out, and ratchet the ratchet up 2 or 3 clicks just to secure the webbing. Next, you will untie the white guy ropes that were originally attached to the stakes. When you get the white guy ropes unattached from the stakes, then you and your helper will push the side pole up until it's nearly vertical. That will be the original position. And then you will go back to the ratchet straps and you will click each ratchet strap 3 or 4 times or whatever is necessary until the webbing is extremely tight. This is a big help in helping you get your corners tight. In some situations, you may even want to buy ratchet straps for each and every side pole, especially on the larger tents, and this will make getting the tents extremely tight very easy, especially for long-term setup. For the next part of our video, we're going to examine some of the procedures that are necessary in order to tighten a much larger tent. This tent is a 60 by 90 tent, but the procedure is much the same as the 20 by 40. The first thing to do is to square the tent up nice and square. It's important that all your perimeter edges are nicely squared out, particularly on the long side. You will actually have to fold some of the edge of the tent back up on itself so that the edge is straight and not bowed out. Notice how the guys are pulling away from each other here in all four directions in order to get the tent exactly square, because if the tent is not square, it will never tighten properly.
The reason for having the tent, the webbing, the edge of the tent actually laying on top of the other tent section is you want the webbing in a straight line, because the center sections are actually longer in width. If you were to stretch it out flat, it would be longer in width than from corner to corner of the finished tent. So if you were to lay it, if you were to stretch everything out just as flat as it'd go, the tent would actually bow out on the edges.
So that's why we flap the middle in here.
Right.
After the tent is squared up, the next thing to do will be to position and drive all the tent stakes. The stakes on the corner, the two stakes on the corner on a 60 by 90 tent, should be placed about 5.5 feet from the corner at a 90-degree angle. 5.5 to 6 foot maximum. After you get all the stakes lined up nice and straight, then you can drive them all in preparation for raising the perimeter. Even on a 60-foot wide tent, it's very important that all the stakes are in a nice straight line. If your stakes are bowed out, then your tent will not stretch out properly. Also, your corner placement is very important, where you put your corner stakes. Now that the tent is already up in the air, the first thing to do in preparation for tightening the tent is to align the center poles. You want your center poles to be straight up and down, perfectly vertical, and not tilted in any direction. They should be completely vertical. Once the center poles are up and vertical and the tent is ready to tighten, the first thing that you do is you pick a corner and you tighten that corner snugly, but not as tight as you can, because you do not want to pull your tent out of square. Then you walk to the second corner and tighten it real tight. And you want to make sure that all of your ropes on each side pole are lined up with the stake. If they're not, sometimes you may have to loosen one side of one corner slightly, like they're doing here. Push your corner pole back up, and then walk to the opposite corner. In this case, it would be the first corner where you started to begin with, and tighten that rope so that the tent squares up. After you get the first two corners tight, then you walk down to the far two corners, and you tighten those corners as tight as you can get them. After you get them as tight as you can, you may have to return to the first two corners and retighten those as well, because it's very, very important that all four corners are extremely tight before anything else on the tent is tight at all. On a 60-foot wide tent, it may take 3 or 4 people to tighten each corner as tight as it should be. Just because the rope is tight does not mean that the corner of the tent is tight. When the corner of the tent is tight, there will be no slack whatsoever in the edge of the tent that runs from corner to corner. This is your secret to success, is getting your corners tight before you tighten any of the sides or the ends of the tent. Here you can see how it's taking 3 men all their effort to get this corner tight, and they may have already tightened it twice, but they're being very particular to make sure that they get their corners extremely tight. After you get your corners tight, then you will go to one of the 60-foot sides or the ends, and you will begin to tighten your ropes one by one from one corner towards the other corner. However, you do not want to get the first end extremely tight, because if you do, you'll pull your tent out of square. After you get the first end tight, then you walk to the opposite end, and you'll tighten the opposite 60-foot end as well. Once both ends are tight, then you will begin tightening one of the sides of the tent. After you get all the sides tight, you need to go around and check each rope. If you see a loose rope like they did here in the video, you need to retighten that rope. Every rope should be checked over and over 2 or 3 times until the tent is completely tight. The tent should be extremely tight, and it should look tight from outside the tent as well as from inside the tent. You'll notice that the wind is blowing hard here. In fact, on this day the wind was blowing about 30 miles an hour, but the guys were still able to get the tent up and get it extremely tight because of the extra effort that they put into it, going back and forth and retightening all the ropes. Well, that pretty much does it. I think if you follow all the procedures that we've discussed in this video, you'll find that you'll be able to get your tent as tight as a drum. It will not have bags in the corners, and it will not collect water as long as you keep it tight. Remember, a tight tent will withstand much more wind as well.